everyone. And if you want to mute yourself, go ahead. We are excited to have the topic of environmentalism today. It's one I've wanted to do for a long time. I'm Charlie Froman. Jeff Cantor, my co-partner in healthcare disruption and this Libertarian weekly event, is out for family reasons, so I'm subbing in. There, if you're looking at the screen, is our bit.ly to register for this event, Freedom Hub Working Group. If you want to look at any of our past videos at Brighteon, there's the bit.ly for that. And we are sponsored by our health company, really our marketing site, yourfreedomhub.com, where we are trying to unite activists and entrepreneurs to disrupt everything for a better world. And, you know, we have some focus on healthcare and financial empowerment to, you know, help affect some change specifically in specific markets. Now, we always preview coming guests, and coming up next week, we're going to continue the environmental aspect with geoengineering. And this is a controversial issue. And the reason we timed it this way was because a science writer at Reason Magazine, Ronald Bailey, proposed cloud seeding to stem climate change. So he brought it up, others have as a proposal. But Jim Lee at Climate Viewer is going to expand on that with some experiments that may be going on right now and some of the pros and cons. You know, we need more transparency and discussion on this controversial topic. So we're gonna broach it. If you're brave, come join us. In 2 weeks, we have an emissary from Gorbachev's government in Russia. Back in the 80s, Yuri Maltsev was one of his econ advisors. He's now at the Mises Institute, other think tanks. He's going to update us on the status of desocialization worldwide. And so that's going to be interesting to see what he says about countries that we are following or not so following. In 3 weeks, the great Ron Paul issue from a decade ago in the Fed. How's it going? It doesn't seem to be doing much, but it's a great issue. The galvanizing issues. Richard Ebeling from the Future of Freedom Foundation will update us on that. And then a month from now, we'll have Hesham El Malaji from the group Muslims for Liberty. You know, liberty is in all cultures from way back in history, and we want to allow everyone to make their case to get everyone on the same liberty bandwagon. And today, we are excited to have a very well-regarded expert in free market environmentalism. He did serve in the Department of Natural Resources in Washington State as a member of the executive team. So he's been in the trenches of government and how to deal with it, how to clean up the environment. He now directs the Center for the Environment at the Washington Policy Center, which is the think tank in the state of Washington. Every state has one, or sometimes more than one. And the Washington Policy Center deals with all the big issues, not just the environment, but that's Todd's area. He's the author of a book that I love the title of it, Eco Fads. That's an eye catcher, you know, how the rise of trendy environmentalism is harming the environment. He has been an expert panelist at the Wall Street Journal for these issues. He's authored numerous studies, including incentives to deal with the greenhouse gases and this whole green building mandate that we're seeing with the Smart Cities Initiative and other projects across the country. Interestingly, he did PR for some sports teams, Todd, the Supersonics, which I think disappeared a decade ago or so.
They're now in Oklahoma, yeah.
Okay, and the Mariners. He has his master's from the University of Washington. And so I will now stop sharing and let you pick it up there. Todd, and you're going to share your screen now. And I'll turn off my video.
Yeah, if you can all see that.
You can.
Yeah. So, well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about this. Oftentimes when I give discussions, I focus on one particular area or subject in the environment rather than sort of the philosophy of why a market-based approach actually does better for the environment. And you did a little bit of it, but I want to talk about sort of how I got here. You mentioned that I worked at the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. Coming to environmental policy is not something I planned in college. I knew environmentalists in college. They always were kind of weird and looked like they smelled bad. And so I didn't do a lot of that. But then I worked in some politics, and I got a job at the Washington State Department of Natural Resources after we have a position in Washington State called the Commissioner of Public Lands. And so I helped get him elected. He took me to Olympia, and I started going through the forests with foresters and biologists and talking about the issues that we faced. And I said to him one time, I said, you know, what you're saying here is not what I hear in the media or from politicians or things like that. And they said, oh yeah, that stuff, yeah, that's not what we actually have to deal with. And I thought it was really interesting. So I dealt with spotted owl and old growth forests and forest health issues, which now forest health issues are coming back again. I think you've seen that Northern California is shutting down its power for several days because they're worried about forest fires, in part because our forests are not very fire prone, or they are fire prone, but they're not very fire resistant because they're not very healthy. And I currently sit on the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council trying to recover habitat for salmon and orca. So I want to, before I talk a little bit about the philosophy, I want to give an example of how political solutions, environmental solutions, and free market solutions play out in the real world. So I am a beekeeper. There's me with my bees. And one of the issues that people address right now is the concern that there is a decline in bee populations and that bees are dying. And the question is why that's true and how do we solve that problem? So typically what we see is that from politicians and from environmental groups is that pesticides called neonicotinoids are actually causing this. And there's a number of stories, and this one I found from a couple of years ago. It says neonicotinoid pesticides are slowly killing the bees. This is what you get from environmental groups and from a lot of politicians saying, well, the solution clearly is to ban neonicotinoids. And the fact is that there is a problem with honeybee populations and mortality. It used to be that about 20% of hives died every year. And now, as you can see from what's called Be Informed, which is a project of the USDA, we now have about 40% of hives dying every year, so double the total mortality. But what's interesting is that when you look at which bees are dying and who's losing their bees, backyard beekeepers, sort of hobbyists like me, have a very high mortality of over 50%. But commercial beekeepers still have a higher mortality than they would like, but are much lower. So the question is, what can we learn from that? There's an additional piece of really interesting information, which is that the total number of colonies in the United States is not decreasing, but it's increasing. So the question is, how is it that mortality has gone up, but populations are also going up? And the answer is that beekeepers, especially commercial beekeepers, have the knowledge and incentives to ensure that their hives don't die, to make sure that they have the hives they need to pollinate almonds and to do the other things that they need to do. Backyard beekeepers like me, I have only a few hives. I don't deal with hundreds of hives a day. And so there are going to be things that I miss. And if my hives die, then I'm not out a lot of money. It's frustrating. I don't like it, but the risks are much lower. So what we see in the case of the honeybees is we see politicians who are making claims because they don't have a lot of context. They're not beekeepers. They don't have the knowledge. They don't have the right incentives to focus on the problem at hand and address the real problem. So they blame what's convenient. And this photo actually on the screen here was on one of the web pages of an environmental group calling for a ban on pesticides. And what I think is interesting is that if you look at that photo, you can notice that there's one that looks different, and that's a yellow jacket. And what these bees have died from is not pesticides or anything else, but from that yellow jacket, because yellow jackets like to eat the bees because they eat protein. And so those bees there actually have been killed by the yellow jacket. But a person who is not an expert wouldn't know that. Because I'm a beekeeper, I instantly saw that. So if we want to solve environmental problems like colony collapse disorder and hive mortality, the best way to do it is to put it in the hands of people who have the knowledge and incentives, rather than people who see it as an opportunity to plug it into planned ideological agendas. That's not just true of honeybees, but it's true across the board. So one question I get in talking about free market environmental solutions is, why do we need these? Aren't the government approaches that we're doing right now, A, the only way, and B, aren't they working? The context that people have for that is understandable, which is that the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act in the early 1970s did a lot to clean our water and clean our air. We have much cleaner air today as a result of the Clean Air Act, and our water is also better. You don't see large outfalls. You don't see big smokestacks. So the problems that were easy for government to address, they addressed. But people are now, as a result, stuck in that 1970s mindset about how you solve everything. And so anytime now there is a problem, we think that government can guide those solutions. But that's not true. And the result is that we waste a lot of money on things that don't work. And let me just give you a few examples. So one of the biggest sources of carbon dioxide emissions, if you're trying to reduce the impact of climate change, is transportation. And the focus is a lot on electric vehicles. So people figure if we can swap out gasoline-powered cars for electric vehicles, we can reduce CO2 significantly. So here in Washington State, we removed the sales tax. We don't have an income tax, so sales tax is fairly high, nearly 10% rather. And so we waived the sales tax on electric vehicles, which turned out to be quite a bit. The question is, though, is it actually working? So we not only waive the sales tax, there's a federal tax credit, and we also have government building electric car charging stations at taxpayer expense. So who is this benefiting? So I took a look at where the electric vehicles in Washington State are using state records and overlapped them with IRS tax records. And what I found, not surprisingly, is that the wealthier the zip code, the more electric vehicles per capita. So basically what we're doing is we're subsidizing the wealthy. We're taxing working people and to subsidize the wealthy. It's not only an issue of inequality, it's also frankly ineffective. Somebody making enough to afford a nice Tesla doesn't need a subsidy to buy that car. They're going to buy that car because it's a cool car, because they like it. So even if all you care about, even if you don't care about the inequality or the unfairness of it, even if all you care about is reducing CO2 effectively, this is a very bad policy. So why do we do it? Electric cars are cool. Everybody wants to be part of the future. Electric cars are interesting. People like Elon Musk, so they want to line his pockets and then take credit for doing something about climate change. It's not the only example of a failed policy. In Washington State, as along with a number of other states, school districts and legislatures have mandated what they call green building standards for schools. They argue that these standards created by the U.S. Green Building Association do a lot for not only energy savings, but also create a better learning environment for kids. So we passed this in 2005 in Washington State. And what I thought was interesting was they, in the hearing, they gave an example of a green school in the Tacoma School District, which is south of Seattle. And they said it was already saving 30% on electricity costs. So I did a public disclosure request and looked at the utility data compared to other schools. What was interesting is that they had actually built 2 new middle schools in the same year, one using the green building standards and one that did not. And when I compared the utilities between the 2 schools, both of the same age, both of the same size, both middle schools, I found that the non-green school used 30% less energy than the green school. There's a variety of reasons for this, and I thought this was really interesting. So I started looking at other schools around Washington State and ended up doing this across the country. So so I wrote a piece about it saying that green schools, not just in the Tacoma School District, but in the Lake Washington School District and Spokane School District and elsewhere, that the green schools used more energy than traditional schools. The sponsor of the bill got very upset with me, said, we're going to sort this out. There's an auditing agency for the Washington State Legislature called JLARC. So JLARC did their own study, and he said JLARC is going to find out the truth. So the graph there represents what they found. And what they found is of the 9 green schools that they looked at, 5 of them ranked in the bottom half for energy efficiency. Now, what's amazing about that is these are brand new schools. You bring brand new green schools online and they instantly are in the bottom half of energy efficiency. Only 1 of the 9 schools was the most efficient in the school district. So the state agency wrote this up, and the sponsor of the green school bill got so angry, he sent off a letter to the agency accusing them of sounding like Todd Myers, which I thought was a compliment. But even he was forced to recognize that these schools weren't performing. And so subsequently, I did studies in Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, North Carolina, Ohio, and elsewhere. And I find the same thing in all of those other communities. The best one I found, though, was in New Mexico. Albuquerque was quite bad, but Santa Fe actually did quite well. And so I called the facilities director rather, and told her, you have the best performing green schools I've ever found in the country. And she said, thank you very much. We pay a lot of attention to getting them right. But by the way, we're building a new school and we're not going to use the green building standards because we figured out what works and what don't. And we're going to ditch the standards. So again, why do they do this? Why do we have these green building standards if they don't save energy? So when I wrote my piece for Nevada, I got an email that said, hey, I am the facilities director for the Reno School District, the Washoe County School District. And I thought, oh, this is going to be ugly because I've criticized their schools. And the first sentence was, you're exactly right. I've been trying to explain this to school boards members for a long time that these standards don't work, that they should leave it up to us because we can figure out what makes efficiency. But they want the plaque on the wall. And I think I heard probably 5 different facilities directors across the country tell me the school board folks just want the plaque on the wall. That's how we make political decisions. There's lots of other examples. This is one of my favorites. The map on the left is in California. It was what they said their hydrogen highway, because they were going to switch to hydrogen vehicles and encourage hydrogen vehicles in California. This is from 2004, and they projected that by 2010, there would be 170 hydrogen filling stations for hydrogen vehicles by 2010. You can see the map on the right is one I just pulled yesterday. There are actually 41 stations, nowhere close. And, and here we are in 2019. So again, it's very hard to predict the future of technology. In 2004, we thought hydrogen would be the future. Here we are today, and it's clearly not. And there are some examples of this mentality, of the environmental mentality, that even more absurd. And one example is National Geographic used to do a thing called the Green Dex, where they ranked countries based on how green they were. And what's absurd is that every year they ranked number 1 and number 2, India and China. And India and China sort of went back and forth about who was the greenest country in the world. Now you think about India and China and what the pictures that appear in your mind about air quality, water pollution in the Ganges, things like that, and you would not pick those. But because the mindset of environmentalism is so anti-prosperity, their ideology, their idea of what it means to be green is China and India. And this is the National Geographic. This is not some strange organization. That just simply is not going to be a way to create a positive environmental policy that helps the planet and creates human well-being and flourishing. So having pointed out these problems, people then come to me and say, okay, Todd, what's your idea? There are real environmental problems. What do we do? Which is why I love this quote by Buckminster Fuller. It says, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And people are surprised that market approaches actually do better to help the environment, not just today, but for the long term, and they are sustainable. They are not dependent on who happens to be sitting in the governor's mansion or the presidential seat at any moment in time, because once you provide people incentives to do more with less, they will keep doing it no matter what the political situation is. Now, there's three things that I think we see that really make a difference. The first is access to information. The second is giving individuals the ability to act. And the third is reducing the cost of cooperation, because there are problems that we face that require cooperation. Our concept, our mindset has been that only government can do that. I think Barack Obama once said something like, government is just the name we give to things we do together. But there are lots of ways to do things together that don't rely on politicians and government. Let me just give you some examples. So this is a quote from Barack Obama in 2009 as part of the stimulus package. The federal government gave a huge amount of money to replace old meters with new electricity meters called smart meters. And the smart meters could do a couple of things. One, they could tell utilities when power was out, giving them more power to sort of make sure that your electricity was always on. Second, it could read the meter electronically. You didn't have to have meter readers anymore. But third, and this is what President Obama was focusing on, was that it would give information to individuals about how they were using electricity and the ability to figure out where they could save energy. And it's not in this quote, but where he actually says, you can look at how much you're using by the week, by the day, or even by the hour, which today seems very funny. Well, we have installed these all over the country, and yet we have not seen people using smart meters to save energy in that way, to plan their electricity, to look at their bill. They still get their monthly bill. By way of contrast, there are smart thermostats like Nest or another one called ecobee that do give you more control, but also use artificial intelligence to find ways to help you save energy. And combined with that, now some utilities have started a program with Nest called Rush Hour Rewards. And what Rush Hour Rewards does is it gives you an incentive to move your demand outside of peak hours. About 10% of electricity costs come in 1% of the time, and it's in peak demand. So peak demand is when electricity is the highest cost, but those costs are generally not passed on to residential customers. So it doesn't matter to them whether they're using electricity at 7 p.m. It does to the utility. And so the question is, how do you get people to shift that demand? Well, Nest does this by giving you a little bit of a rebate if you don't use your electricity for those 2 hours. And what it will do is it will turn down or turn up your thermostat by about 2 degrees based on what's necessary during that period of time. But it also does another thing, which is that it preheats or pre-cools your house. So it shifts your demand outside of the peak area to beforehand and lets your house hold the temperature. This is not something that I, even as an energy geek, would have thought of or think to do or can do at my home, because I'm generally not there. But it's something the Nest thermostat can do, and it uses those personal incentives and the technology. And what we're seeing is in places like Southern California and in Portland, Oregon, they did studies comparing which was more effective, and not surprisingly, they found the Nest thermostat was far more effective, despite the fact that government subsidies went to the smart meters and not to the smart thermostats. It's a private innovation that gives people incentives and information that's more effective at saving energy. Let me give you another example. This is a map of Eastern Washington and the forest health in Eastern Washington. What you can see is red is very unhealthy, high priority for improving the health by either doing thinnings or controlled burns or other things like that. And then the yellow are the lowest priority. And if you look down in sort of the lower left-hand corner near Yakima, you can see a large blotch that is yellow, surrounded by red. Those red areas are all federal forests. But the yellow is the Yakima Indian tribe. The Yakima Indian tribe, they can't do whatever they want, but they have much more leeway to go in and care for their forests in a way that makes sense. And so what they have done has been very aggressive over the last 2 decades at thinning forests, at returning them to a healthy status because of forest health concerns, because of forest fire concerns. And you can see the stark contrast between their forests and the forests that are around them in red. And it is an example of how people who have the incentives, because they don't want their forest to burn up, and the ability to act can go in and make a big difference for a natural environment. It's also much better habitat. Unhealthy forests are not just fire prone, they're bad habitat. So it is better in so many ways. They actually ended up building a lumber mill and creating jobs in the community. So it's really a big win. But because the tribe has more leeway than private landowners or the federal government on their land, they were able to do something that others couldn't. And rather than abusing that and destroying their forests, they've returned them to a healthy status. This is one of my favorite examples, and it's something that I'm very excited about, where we now have the opportunity, because of smartphones and the information that we can access through smartphones, to get information and collaborate in ways that we never could before. And what you're looking at right here is a map of the world as people are entering bird watching lists. So there's an app that was created by Cornell University called eBird. And what eBird does is allows bird watchers to go out and remember and put down what birds they've seen, excuse me, in their most recent outing. And they can create checklists. And they actually have a web page that shows in real time where around the world those checklists are appearing. It knows where you are, when you are, and what kind of birds you saw. So Cornell University now has a database of millions and millions of these bird sightings of different types of birds. And what they have done, and what you're seeing here, all these little dots, is just one day. So what they've done is they used that because they were trying to figure out how to create migratory bird habitat in the Central Valley of California. And by using the data, they could get down almost literally parcel by parcel of where the farmers were to see what was most important, because they could track the birds as they migrated in past years because they had that data. So they partnered with the Nature Conservancy, went to those farmers and did a reverse auction and said, how much would we have to pay you to flood your field during January and February to, I think it was 3 or 6 inches of water, to create good habitat for these birds? And the farmers said, well, you'd have to pay me about this much. And they did it. And so they created what's called pop-up wetlands, which is sort of like Airbnb for birds. But it shows the power of aggregated information. None of the people who entered bird checklists thought that what they were doing was helping protect bird habitat. But that's what happened. And there's a very low cost of cooperation and information now, thanks to smartphones, that's giving us all new opportunities to help wildlife. And it's not just government that can now go out and do surveys and see where the birds are and figure out what to do. It is now private organizations with independent information and people collaborating together, essentially costlessly, that create these new opportunities. I think it's really an exciting opportunity, because government is good at doing big things like focusing on big outfalls into the water and big smokestacks. It's very bad at doing distributed problems and dealing with problems over large areas where there's lots of little inputs like wildlife habitat. And this is a good example of the fact that there is an alternative to the government approach. I'll give you one last example. On the left there, you see sort of how transit treats people. I like this photo. I think it's in Europe somewhere, but being from Seattle, it looks a lot like what I deal with in Seattle, waiting for the bus, very rainy day. But on the right is an app called Car2Go. And Car2Go has little cars, BMWs, and primarily Mercedes, and the little two-seater smart cars parked all over Seattle. And what you can do is you can simply pull up an app and see where one is parked near you. You can open it up using your phone, drive wherever you want to go, and then park it there. And then it'll lock up. And you rent it by the hour or by the minute. And it's really convenient. I've used it a few times. The map that's there is actually where my office is, and one that was parked across the street. It's very affordable. And it gives so much flexibility that the city of Seattle and California, University of California, Davis, I believe, did a study to see whether it was having any impact. And what they found was that there are about 9,000 fewer cars in the city of Seattle, based on their estimate, because of systems like Uber and Car2Go. Again, this is not something that government planned. This is a private for-profit business that is using the power of smartphones to collaborate and connect people to resources and use them more efficiently, which is good for them. So with that, I will take any questions, but my basic message is that we need to move beyond the 1970s environmental mindset. We need to move beyond that 1970s environmental mindset and bring policy into the iPhone age, because we now have technology to do things that we simply couldn't in the 1970s. And my book, Eco-Fads, talks about why that is and about how we currently make policy, which is that we fall for fads that cost a lot, that feel good, but don't do a lot for the environment. Free market using incentives and creating more opportunities through technology can move us beyond that to where the people who make the decisions also feel the rewards of success or the costs of failure in ways that politicians and government simply doesn't. And I say that as somebody who currently sits on a government panel dealing with salmon and who worked in a government agency. I see the good things that government agencies can do, but I also know their limitations, and I can tell you the people in these agencies know their limitations. And I think we need to recognize the role that they can play, but not to fool ourselves to say the government can solve all the environmental problems that we face. And we know that because there are lots of environmental problems that simply are not getting solved, despite the fact that we're spending more and more money on them. And with that, I will turn it back and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Todd. Charlie here. And if folks want to ask a question or make a comment, feel free to click the raise hand option. And if there's noise with your speaking, go ahead and mute yourself. And then if you want to ask a question or make a comment, I can call on you. I have unmuted everyone, so I can start the questions. Todd, I got a few, and there's some background noise. And Todd, that's not you, is it?
I don't believe so.
Okay, so folks, if you think there's some background noise with your microphone, do us a favor and mute yourself so that we can have a good webinar. So let me just go ahead and mute everyone, and I guess some folks aren't listening. So you mentioned protecting salmon, I assume with some sort of rights or property rights that limits over harvesting of them. I know libertarians over the years have tested or considered selling areas of the oceans to fishing companies to introduce a sustainability interest that property owners have, not to over harvest fish. How risky is that whole thing about losing fish populations, and what works?
So let me give you two examples of good market solutions. So there are definitely areas where we are overfished. It's not a surprise to libertarian where you don't have property rights, people are going to overuse the resource. That's just, basic market economics. And so that's what we've seen in some areas where you don't have clear property rights delineated. But what we have done in a number of areas is created a system of what are called catch shares, where you have a right to a certain percentage of a catch. And the catch is set what's called a TAC, a total allowable catch. So that is typically a government limit on how much they think is a sustainable catch year after year. And then you are entitled to 10% or 20% or whatever of that. And what they found is that rather than a fishing season where you have a week to go out and catch everything you can, saying you can catch this many fish and we don't really care when you do it during the course of the year, that not only is safer because if the weather's bad, you don't have to go out. It's also cheaper and more environmentally friendly, right? You don't have to go out into the middle of the ocean to find the fish. You can find them somewhere close by in the designated area. But one of the interesting things is that it reduced what's called bycatch. So if you only have 7 days to catch, the nets that you have are going to be designed to catch everything rapidly, because that's what the governing factor is time, not money. So when you have your technology designed to catch everything rapidly, you're going to get a lot of fish that you shouldn't catch. If, however, the governing factor is money and not time, and trying to reduce reduce the bycatch, then you can change what your nets do, and you can change how you fish. And what they've seen in Alaska, for example, is that when they changed to a catch share system, the bycatch was cut in half, simply by allocating property rights and saying, we don't care how you use them, go ahead and use them. Let me give you one other example of a incentive-based approach for salmon, a habitat that I would like to try in Washington State. So a number of different areas, stream temperatures are a problem. And one reason that they're a problem is that there's not enough shade along those streams. In those areas, you will often see farmers. And if you talk to farmers, they're more than happy to provide that shade. They want to take care of those streams. They like them being there. But you're asking them to sacrifice economically for what is a social good. And too often our mindset is, okay, you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Salmon are a social good, but we're going to put all the costs on you. But there are programs now that reward farmers for creating hedges or planting trees that can create shade. And one of the interesting ones is that along a stream, they only get the grant or they only get the payment if 50% of the farmers along that stream opt in. Because one farmer, it's nice to create that shade, but it may not do very much if his neighbors don't do the same thing. And so you get that sort of organized approach. This is sort of like what Eleanor Ostrom talked about, how you have a local collaborative solution. It may not be a pure property rights solution, but it's a local collaborative solution where the people who have the local knowledge and incentives are making those decisions. And so I like those approaches rather than sort of pure government mandates that say, here's how much buffer you will leave. Sorry that it costs you a lot of money. There's better solutions that are more durable and I think more sustainable over the long run.
Thank you, Todd. And I see 2 registrants with their hands up. So folks, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, click that raise hand option and I'll unmute you. Wendy, let me unmute you now. So you could go ahead and ask your question. Wendy, you may have yourself muted, so go ahead and...
I think I've unmuted myself.
Go ahead. Yep.
Todd, as always, thank you for your insightful commentary. I'm wondering if you could comment on you've talked about how when we devolve power from the federal government to more local jurisdictions, we tend to see more success. I'm wondering if you could comment on the recent issue in California, like with the car manufacturers and what that means for emissions.
So yeah, it's a challenge. So what Wendy is referring to is that California has regulations on fuel efficiency. The Trump administration came in and undid the Obama administration's rules, requirements on fuel efficiency. But California kept them and said, here's what we're going to require of all vehicle manufacturers in California. And because California is such a large market, they essentially can dictate to the car manufacturers, not just what happens there, but essentially what happens across the country. And the manufacturers themselves went along with that and actually have now encouraged the federal government to use that standard as well, because they want a level playing field. So it's very difficult to solve those sorts of problems, but I think it is emblematic of an interesting problem, which is that regulation favors the rich. And what we think of, so often the rhetoric that we hear is that government and corporations are at odds, that we need government regulation to keep the corporations' power in check and represent the people. But what we actually see on the ground is that that's not the case, that government likes big business because it's far easier to cut deals with a few big businesses and impose regulations or requirement that way, even without laws, just to sort of threaten regulations and then cut a deal, than it is with lots of small operators. And furthermore, when you do that, you lock out potential competitors, which means that you don't get the innovation and new companies that often not just move our economy forward, certainly, but also are the ones who are coming up with new environmental solutions. So it's a very difficult situation. We've had a similar thing, frankly. Spokane County in Washington State required that they take the phosphorus out of dishwasher soap, and some of the companies that make dishwashing soap saw the writing on the wall, and just because one county in Washington State did it for the whole country. So there is that very difficult relationship between big business and big government, which indicates that it's not just important to devolve power in government, it's also important to give small businesses the opportunity to compete and create new options for us, because it's very easy for big government and big corporations to collaborate and sort of lock consumers out.
Thanks, Todd. I'm only laughing because Charles unmuted me just, I think, so I can say thank you. I have no further comments on that.
I do, and thanks, Wendy. Todd, cafe standards, don't they kill people by making cars more dangerous, number one? And number two, isn't that why my family station wagon disappeared in the 70s? And now we have a two-tiered system of giant SUVs and tiny, dangerous cars?
I think your family station wagon disappeared because of just simple good taste. But yes, and the best evidence that cafe standards make cars more dangerous is that when the cafe standards stalled out for, I think, more than a decade, when we didn't introduce new cafe standards, fuel efficiency didn't increase, but what did increase is the weight of the vehicle and the safety of the vehicle. You started adding all sorts of airbags and other safety equipment that made the cars safer. So the auto industry recognized very clearly that there was a trade-off, and when they didn't have to meet the increased CAFE standards, they used that trade-off to create safer cars, which is what people wanted. That's
great. I got some other questions, but I see Dave Demer's hand up, so I'm going to unmute you, David, if you want to. There you go. Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Charlie. Todd, I'm David Demarest with the Roads to Freedom Foundation. And as an amateur economist, I always look at motivations of political and economic actors. And we all know about the profit motive for the free market. So the question is, what is the profit motive in the political sector for politicians? Well, it's not rocket science. Their profit is getting elected, and perhaps the perks that go along with that, like hot dogs and beer, go with baseball. So if the solution for environmental problems is unlikely to be found in the political sector, how do we as individuals help with the transition to finding and implementing private sector solutions?
This is a great question because you're exactly right. The problem with political solutions is that what they reward is image. And that's why I called my book Eco Fads, which is that they fall for the fads and then politicians take steps that don't actually work, but improve their image. And so when they do things like subsidize electric vehicles or do green buildings that don't help the environment, no politician is going to say, boy, I really screwed that one up, didn't I? Because the profit, the incentives are to have a good image, not to help the environment. That's first and foremost. And they will sacrifice the environment for their self-image. How do we change that? The beauty is that we're already seeing changes to that. And this is actually a book that I'm writing right now about how technology gives individuals the power to help the environment in ways that we haven't had before. There was a survey that was done last year where it asked people who believed that climate change was a crisis and people who were skeptical of climate science about what they thought the government should do. And then they went and asked them, okay, what do you do in your day-to-day life? And what they found is that people who were skeptical of climate science did more for the environment in their day-to-day life. And we need to give people more incentives and more power to do things in their own life that are essentially permissionless. The car-to-go example I gave was not something that was done by government. Indeed, government was skeptical at first because the parking spaces that were needed, the city had to say, okay, you can use these areas for parking. So there was a little bit of a fight between some cities and car-to-go initially. But those are the things that are coming up with the new ways to help the environment. And the beauty is, if you don't save money, if you don't save gasoline, if you don't save electricity, if you don't achieve your goals, you may not announce it to the world on Facebook that you screwed up, but you will change your behavior because that's what your incentive is, in a way that politicians won't, because their incentive is not to change their behavior. Their incentive is to protect their image. So I see a lot of opportunity for permissionless innovation to supplant what we're doing in terms of government. I think it will take time to show that these things can be effective. But one example that stands out of my mind is that the city of Seattle, where we have a city council member who openly calls herself a Trotskyite, regulated Uber and did a number of things to try to make life hard on Uber to protect the taxi medallions holders. And the next city council, their council chambers was overflowing with Uber drivers and Uber riders who didn't want this. Seattle is not a libertarian city. It is a socialist city. And even in a city like Seattle, when you give people freedom and opportunities to do these sorts of things, they're going to protect them. So I see their real hope there. But that's what we need to do, is develop more of those solutions.
David, follow-up? If not, Wendy, I see your hand up, unless that's a holdover from your last question. Go ahead.
No, I have a new one. Todd, I haven't seen you put up the slide before. You're kind of 1, 2, 3 to make a difference. We need information, the ability to act, and we need to reduce the cost of cooperation. And I really appreciated that. And I think that when we talk about these issues, because we're trying to overcome some misconceptions, sometimes reducing I've just been thinking of this during your talk. Sometimes I think reducing the cost of cooperation is about bridging the divide between different, maybe we could say mainstream environmentalists or political environmentalists, and on the one hand, and then on the other hand, results focused or market based environmentalists or conservationists. And one of the other things that I noticed you doing today for the first time is using that inequality explanation for things more than I've heard you before. And I think that this is a really helpful tool for helping people think about these things. It's certainly one that I've experienced working on these issues in the developing world. And I wonder if there are any other sort of tricks, not tricks, but useful hints and tips that would empower those of us on this call to go out and inform people about these issues. We can talk about inequality. What else can we talk about to help people realize there are other effective ways of looking at these problems?
Yeah, I think the cost of cooperation, is straight from sort of the Coase theorem about, why is it that, what are the transaction costs to work with other folks, and how can we reduce those transaction costs? And that, I think, is something that smartphones and information technology have done extremely well. It's hard to remember, but the iPhone has only been around for 11 years. That is not a lot of time, and yet it has already pretty massively changed our daily behavior, right? We now talk about people spending too much time on their smartphones, and they're just, they're not that old. But it has empowered people, especially in developing countries. So Bill and Melinda Gates put out a letter every year, and this year was things that surprised them. And one of the things that surprised them was the power of smartphones and of cell phones to empower women in third world countries. That's how useful these technologies are, because they're so democratized, because people can use them anywhere and gain power from them. There's a great example in Ghana. Cal Berkeley went out to Ghana, and they wanted to try to improve the performance of the electricity system, because there were lots of power outages. And the challenge for the utility was they couldn't figure out where the power outages were unless people reported it to them, and people didn't always report it to them, and there was, it's a difficult system. So what they did is they simply developed an app that they could put on people's phones. And if the phone was charging and suddenly lost power, lost the charge, and the Wi-Fi went off, it would send a signal to the utility that their power was probably out. And so they started testing this, and they just put it on a bunch of phones, and it worked. And the utility could quickly pinpoint where power outages were and get them back online. So even in Ghana, even in a place where the government institutions are weaker than in the Western world, where the technology is not as good, where the electrical system is not as good, simply putting an app on a phone made a huge difference in improving the reliability of electricity. And where you see a lot of these improvements is not in the United States, but in developing countries, because there, ironically, they don't have the government institutions that are fighting them. It is a sort of the Wild West, and there are lots of opportunities. And that's where I think these things are really exciting, not just for improving the human condition, but for solving environmental problems.
Very good, Todd. And we are coming up to the end of our weekly hour webinar. I want to thank you for your fantastic presentation. If I had time for one more question, it would be, Ron Paul's campaign example, where a century ago, speaking of these cronies capturing regulations and agencies, courts would make polluters pay. And I don't know the full history of how courts stopped making polluters pay. I know Governor Gary Johnson in the campaign said he needed the EPA and Superfund to close down a polluting mining company in the Red River, New Mexico. And I was thinking that may be, but where were the courts to do that? Because the only way to stop the cronies from capturing regulations is to have the courts get stronger, right?
I think that's certainly true, but again, we've seen our courts can certainly become politicized. So there is a danger there. So, but yes, rule of law is absolutely critical in a lot of these situations. But if you can create the right incentives for people to do the right thing and collaborate, then you can create even more durable systems that you don't have to worry about becoming politicized. And I think that's the opportunity that we have now with new technology. So I totally agree that rule of law and those sorts of things are very important. They're even more important because polluter pay means something different in 1970 than it does in 2019. In Puget Sound, where I'm working on salmon recovery, the pollution is not from big outfalls. It's very hard to identify who the polluters are because the polluters are small bits of oil, small bits of brake dust, all these sorts of things that aggregate into Puget Sound. If you want to address a disaggregated, a distributed problem, you need distributed solutions, not centralized solutions. So in some circumstances, making the polluter pay, enforcing the rule of law and property rights is very important. There's no doubt about it. But we need to go beyond that because not all environmental problems have a single identifiable polluter. And the ones that we have the most difficulty solving, there are no single identifiable polluters, but many, many small ones. And the only way to deal with those is market approaches that are distributed across lots of people and give people the incentives to make the small but important incremental changes that help the environment.
That was well said. Thank you. So as we close, I'm going to preview a coming guest again. And before I do that, Todd, how do folks reach you?
You can go to our webpage at washingtonpolicy.org and see what we do, not just on the environment, but on other issues. My email address is there. I'm always happy to talk to people. And then you can follow me on Twitter. Twitter is a scary place these days, but my tweets are good. And it's at WA Policy Green.
Excellent, Todd. And coming up, we have geoengineering, which Ronald Bailey at reason.com, I believe the magazine, proposed to stem climate change. So we have Jim Lee from Climate Viewer to talk about that whole controversy and the need for transparency and more studying. And then we have Yuri Maltsev and imagery from the Gorbachev perestroika days in the 80s, talking about the state of world desocialization from the Mises Institute and other think tanks. Then End the Fed, that great campaign slogan of Ron Paul's from a decade ago. Richard Ebeling from the Future of Freedom Foundation will update us on that old issue. And then Hesham El Maligi from Muslims for Liberty will talk about liberty in that part of the world and population and where it affects us all, that everyone gets into liberty. So that is it for this week.